context around which that GPA occurs, right? So we never look at anything in a vacuum. We don't look at a raw GPA in a transcript and say, okay, this student has a 3.75, this student has a 3.65, and so this student is clearly stronger than this student. That's really just not how we approach it. We really dig into that transcript. And so we are digging that apart. We're looking for, I mentioned earlier, trends in the transcript, right? So if a student has improved during their 4 years, that's really important for us to note. We look for areas of strength or weakness. So maybe a student, has some trouble in math and sciences, but excels in English and social sciences. We look at, times in a student's career when they've struggled. And a lot of times those are really explainable. So I can tell you how often we see a transcript where a student has a strong freshman year and then they get into their sophomore year and there's a dip. There's a big dip in grades. And then they get into their junior year and they've rebounded and they start to do better in their grades. But they come to us so concerned about that sophomore year. And the truth is that most of the time there's a really rational explanation for that. It might be something like, my parents were going through a rough divorce. Loss of a family member. It might be, and I think what we're going to be seeing for the next 3 years is it's a COVID year, right?
Yeah.
And it's a year where students were in remote classes. Maybe they had housing insecurity, food insecurity, whatever is going on at home, so many different things, and their grades struggled during that period. And so that's something that, that's why the application exists, is for students to be able to kind of give us the context to understand that transcript. And so the opportunities for that are certainly in the essay. There's also an additional information section in the Common Application, and then letters of recommendation can corroborate what we hear from the student as well, if your counselors and your teachers are aware of what was going on during that time. And so, all these things in the transcript, there's no such thing as a perfect transcript. Even when we see all A's in a transcript, those students also were struggling and had context to deal with and things like that. And that's why the application exists, is to kind of help us what was going on there. And, we're reading for two things simultaneously when we do that holistic review process. We're reading for achievement, certainly, right? And some students have significant achievement in their records, where they've demonstrated over and over again that they can really excel in the classroom, outside of the classroom. They've, started companies or NGOs or, done some incredible things. But just as often, we're actually reading for promise. And we're reading for, trying to identify, okay, these are the sparks of promise that a student has shown, and they may not have been able to achieve because of the context that they are coming from at a level of some other students. But we think to ourselves, we know the resources that exist at Denison or at whatever institution we are at, and what can this student do in our context, right? If we take that student and put them in the context of the resources that exist here and the space and freedom and opportunities that they're going to have here, what do we think that they can accomplish? And so that's another thing that we're always trying to identify in that application review process. And again, it doesn't necessarily just come through in a raw GPA number. We really need that context to help understand.
No, and that's so important. And you kind of allude to that prior, right, is you're looking not only who'll come to your campus, right? And by the way, you guys across the board have done some great, I love those student panels, informational, virtual tours. I mean, that's what I'm telling everyone, like, do those before those kids leave, because they're not going to be that many available. But, but the thing that you mentioned too is also taking away the test equals the planes a little bit for social justice. Many years ago at one of those NECAC conferences, I interviewed the filmmaker from The Test and the Art of Thinking. And they were talking about tests and, doing all this preparation, but they didn't talk about enough about the decades of research to show how the test doesn't really show one's potential. Right. A lot of times I say, to students, like, colleges are also looking for that ganas, right? Which is, if we translate that, right, is, that motivation, that fire in your derriere, right? So, and because because a lot of people don't realize, I think it's, depending, I think the average, I don't know what the latest results pre-COVID-19, but about 60% actually finish college. Right. And I know those stories. And so there's so many other indicators that are out there. So based on that, and based on now we're starting to go into a new admissions year, what what is Denison University doing for next year? Right. Because that's a big question that, God, we had so many from juniors and sophomores, like, wait, do I need to start prepping? Because some kids do prep for 2 years. Do not do that. So what is your campus doing? And because I know if everyone hasn't heard about the National Center for Fair and Open Testing, which you can look at fairtest.org, they for a very long time have been advocating take away the tests. It's for mental health reasons, for social justice reasons, et cetera, right? They have this new campaign, Just Say No to Spring 2021 Standardized Tests, why and how to opt out. What's Denison doing, and what do you think, as a professional who's been out there for a long time, what's going to be happening?
Yeah. So at Denison, we've been test optional for just over a decade. We're certainly not the first. It's the schools up in Maine, our buddies at Bowdoin and Colby, who have been doing that for a very long time. But we were fairly early on in this cycle of being test optional. The advantage to that for us is that we have over a decade of information and data and experience that shows us that, again, we don't need tests to make strong decisions to bring the best students to Denison and students that are going to be really successful. So what's going to happen going forward, and this is, just kind of my prediction, having been in a few different places, I think that most admission offices are pretty confident that they can make decisions without those test scores. They read thousands of applications every single year. They get a strong sense of what qualities, what characteristics are evidence to them that a student can be successful in the classroom at their institutions. I think it's the people outside of the admission offices at those institutions who are skeptical of that. They see test scores as a standardized measure because they don't live and breathe this world necessarily. To them, GPAs all come in different shapes and sizes, and some schools don't even offer GPAs. And, they're looking for a standard measure in order to judge themselves against other institutions, certainly, in the rankings craze and all of that, but also to measure progress for their own institution over time. And so that's why I think test scores have been so entrenched, is, many of these boards of trustees and cabinets and presidents rely on those markers as sort of a standardized measure. What's going to happen this year is admission offices are going to demonstrate to their institutions, as happened at Denison, well over a decade ago, that, hey, we didn't have test scores this year. We had some, but not nearly as many as we typically have. And we were still able to make really successful decisions. And we're bringing in these unbelievably impressive, highly capable students, full of promise, full of achievement, who are going to do great things here. And the boards and the cabinets and the presidents are going to say, oh, yeah, this class of students looks really similar to previous classes, although maybe it's a little bit more diverse. And maybe there are some students in this group that we wouldn't have had a chance at enrolling otherwise, because we were so reliant on those test scores. So they're going to see those positives, and it's going to be really, really hard for any of those institutions, I think, to go the other direction. The other element is so many institutions are seeing what a barrier testing was, not only to enrolling those students, but just for them to apply, to consider their universities. You're seeing huge application numbers for schools that went test optional for the first time this year. The Ivy Plus group and those really highly selective colleges are seeing massive application increase. And it's really mostly attributable, I would say, to the fact that all of a sudden that test score barrier is not in the way for so many students, so many first-generation students, low-income students, students of color, that never saw themselves at those institutions because they thought, well, I don't have the test scores. There's just no way I'm going to get in without the test scores. All of a sudden they see a path for themselves, and they're applying in really high numbers. And if you are one of those colleges or universities and you saw this increase in, again, really, really strong kids that are clearly going to be capable of success at your institutions, I just don't see how you turn around and say, well, we're not interested in them anymore. We're going to go back to requiring test scores and put that barrier back up. It just seems very unrealistic to me. So I think test optional is here to stay. There may be some institutions that try to backtrack on this. There are a lot of places that have said that they're on a 1 or 2 or 3 year pilot program, which is perfectly understandable. College, it's what we do in colleges. We study things, right? So we want to get the data, collect it, study it, analyze it, and see what the results are. So I think that's perfectly understandable. But we also know from the many, many institutions that have gone test optional, we pretty much know what the results are going to be, right? These classes are going to get more diverse. They're going to be just as strong academically, just as strong in the classroom, just as strong contributors, and the positives are going to far outweigh the negatives in my estimation. So that's, again, just a guess, but an educated guess, based on my experience at some other places.
No, and I think if you just go to the FAIR Test website, like you've mentioned, many have remained permanent, like your campus. There's so many who are going test optional. I mean, I was a little bit surprised because Stanford was one of the almost last ones that said we're going test optional for fall 21. But they were one of the first ones who were not traditionally test optional who said we're going to be test optional for fall 22. And I appreciate how they said, we don't expect, also like for extracurricular activities, we don't expect you to go away and, save orangutans during COVID-19. Yep. But at the same time, as you said, I think there was a lot of shock for kids who have been focusing so much on the number, test prep, testing, just the GPA, and they're like, wait, why did I not get in? Well, like you said, there's been so many applications of so many incredible students that show that they have a lot of potential, not only to graduate, but be great future alums because of also their activities, what they do in the classroom. Mm-hmm. And it's been, I wish I could go and say, hey, the reason why X, Y, and Z got in because they did X, Y, and Z. And you just focused on a number, and that's not what college is about. It's about sitting with that professor, asking more questions, wanting to do that research. I remember I tell students, because during COVID-19, like, well, I don't know what to do. And I'm like, well, if you love engineering, I had this one kid who didn't have much resources pre-COVID-19. It's like he literally took apart a microwave oven and put it back together. I'm like, there was no doubt in anyone's mind about that. Or I have another kid who loves STEM, and he grew algae in his bedroom. His mom must be incredible, or dad. Yeah. And then try to see if he could get electricity out of it, right? Or I just had kids, who just created blogs. I mean, there's just so much. Or someone who just, went to help out a neighbor constantly because they couldn't go shopping. I mean, that says so much more than any GPA and test score.
Oh my gosh! Like what a better use of time that those things are. Contributing to a student's personal development and just a much more interesting way to spend your time. I think the only good thing about test prep is it's good practice to sit in one place and do something that's boring for a while because that's something you're probably going to have to do a few more times in your life. Other than that, I don't see any value in that test preparation whatsoever. It'd be so much more valuable to take apart every microwave oven in the country. That's a much better way to spend your time, I think.
Yeah, well, my dad would say, I have a shovel of dirt for you to clean for 3 hours. So he may say that as well, too. Now, you also, and I know you're not an institution that is test-free, right? But you did do a presentation not too long ago with UCLA that's going test-free. Can you just share with our audience, what does that mean? The reason why I'm using test-free, it is also known as test-blind, but test-free is, I think we feel like it's a better term to use. So could you tell our families, what does it mean when an institution is test-free?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, I was talking earlier about there are some elements of the application that are required, like the transcripts and letters of recommendation, the application itself, some elements that are optional, like test scores. And then test-free essentially means that testing is in that category, even below optional, where it's an item that will not be reviewed by the admission committee whatsoever. So you've seen some smaller colleges, places like Dickinson and Hampshire, I believe, move towards that test-free option where they're basically saying, testing will not be considered for any student, even if they choose to submit test scores. And then recently, you've seen the University of California system move towards that as they develop their own testing system potentially. And so, that's a big move for the University of California system, the largest, most successful, public university system in the world, really, to move that way. And so we're going to get a lot of evidence soon from the University of California about what test-free means for their selection process and how they're still able to admit students with the complete absence of test scores. I think that most small colleges are more inclined to give students the agency of saying whether or not they want tests included or a lot of elements included in their application, so the students themselves can choose if they want to submit those or or not. And so I don't know if you will immediately see a broad movement towards test-free like you have with test-optional. But the University of California system is massive and very influential. And so by their example, I think you'll see a lot of colleges at least having that conversation now, which would have seemed completely out of the realm of possibility even 2 or 3 years ago, really. That was exceptionally rare. So it'll be fascinating